The rain in West Virginia doesn't wash things clean. It just turns the coal dust into a slick, black paste that coats your windshield, your boots, and eventually, your lungs. I was 28, hungry for a commission, and stupid enough to think I could convince the folks of Blackwood County to sign over their mineral rights to a conglomerate out of Pittsburgh. It was late October when my Ford blew a radiator hose on a switchback road 3 miles outside of a town called Cinder Creek. I walked the rest of the way in the downpour, the mud sucking at my heels with a sound like a dying breath. I ended up at the Miller House, a boarding establishment that was essentially a rotting Victorian carcass, holding itself together with termite spit and layers of peeling lead paint. The proprietor was a man named Silas, a withered old-timer with skin like cured tobacco leaf, and eyes that looked like they'd seen God leave the room a long time ago. That first night, the storm knocked out the power lines. The darkness in those mountains isn't like city darkness. It's heavy, physical. It presses against your eardrums. Silas and I sat on the wraparound porch, nursing a bottle of mason jar moonshine that tasted like kerosene and regret. The only light came from the ember of his pipe and the occasional jagged streak of lightning illuminating the ridgeline. "You looking at the Vance property tomorrow?" Silas asked. His voice sounded like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. "That's the plan," I said, swirling the liquor. "If the deed holds up." Silas spat over the railing. The spit vanished into the black. "Don't go up there, son. That land is sour. Been sour since '34. I chuckled, the arrogance of the city still protecting me. "Soil toxicity, we have tests for that." "Not toxic," Silas whispered, leaning in. The smell of wet wool and old smoke clung to him. "It's wrong. The dirt there. It don't know the difference between planting and burying." He poured us another 3 fingers of shine, and as the thunder rolled across the valley like a drum roll for a hanging, he told me why the Vance place had been left to rot for 80 years. The year was 1934. The Great Depression hadn't just hit the country. It had taken a hammer to its knees. Here in the hollows, folks were used to lean times, but this was different. The mines had shuttered, the crops turned to dust before they breached the soil, and the winter came early with a frost that felt like judgment. Elias Vance was a hard man, cut from granite and scripture. He lived in a farmhouse up on the ridge with his wife, Martha, and their 3 boys. Elias was the kind of man who believed he could outwork the devil. When the food ran out, he hunted. When the game vanished, he trapped. When the traps stayed empty, he boiled shoe leather and tree bark. But starvation is a patient killer. It doesn't take you all at once. It chips away at you. It took the youngest first. Caleb. He was 7 years old. A scrawny thing with eyes too big for his face and a laugh that used to echo off the canyon walls. By February, Caleb stopped laughing. Then he stopped walking. The fever took him on a Tuesday, in the dead gray light of dawn. Martha wept until she was dry, a hollowed-out husk of a woman. But Elias? Elias didn't weep. He just stared at the small, stiff body wrapped in a burlap sack on the kitchen table. Something in Elias broke that day. It wasn't a snap you could hear. It was a silent fracture, deep in the bedrock of his mind. He buried the boy under the twisted oak tree in the backyard, the ground frozen so hard it sparked against the shovel. For 3 weeks, the house was silent. Martha tried to keep the other 2 boys, Thomas and William, alive on thin gruel and prayer. But Elias stopped eating entirely. He would stand by the window, staring at that patch of disturbed earth under the oak tree. He'd mutter to himself, arguing with the air, his eyes bloodshot and wide. Then, the rumors started. Folks in Cinder Creek whispered that Elias had been seen trekking up to Blackroot Ridge, way past where civilized folks went. That was where an old woman lived, Mamie Yarrow. They called her a healer to her face and a witch behind her back. She was Appalachia old. Older than the coal seams, some said. She dealt in roots, blood, and things that didn't belong in the King James Bible. One night, a storm hit, much like the one rattling the windows of the boarding house while Silas spoke to me. The wind howled like a banshee. Elias stood up from his chair, put on his coat, and grabbed a shovel. "Where are you going, Elias?" Martha had screamed, clutching the older boys. "To get him," Elias said. His voice was flat, dead. "I'm going to get my boy." "He's gone, Elias. He's with the Lord." "The Lord didn't want him," Elias snarled, opening the door to the raging night. "So I'm taking him back." He walked out into the rain and didn't come back for 3 days. Martha waited. She paced the floorboards until the wood wore smooth. She thought the cold had taken him, or a bear, or perhaps he'd just walked off the edge of the world. She was preparing herself to tell Thomas and William that they were orphans. But on the 4th morning, just as the sun was bleeding a pale red light over the mountains, the front door latch clicked. Clack, clack. Martha froze. She stood in the kitchen, a knife in her hand, terrified of what might walk through that door. It opened slowly, groaning on rusted hinges. Elias stood there. He was covered in mud from head to toe, his clothes shredded, his fingernails black with soil. He looked like he'd crawled out of a grave himself. He was shivering violently, but he was smiling. A wide, wet, impossible smile. "I told you," Elias rasped, stepping aside. From behind his leg, a small figure stepped into the kitchen. It was Caleb. He was wearing the same clothes he'd been buried in, his Sunday best, now stained with clay and mildew. His skin was the color of curdled milk, and he smelled ripe, like wet leaves and copper. "Caleb?" Martha whispered, the knife clattering to the floor. The boy didn't answer. He didn't blink. He just stood there, his chest rising and falling with a shallow, ragged rhythm that didn't sound like breathing. It sounded like air being forced through a blocked pipe. Elias fell to his knees, hugging the boy, weeping with joy. "Look at him, Martha! I brought him back! I paid the toll, and I brought him back!" But the boy didn't hug him back. Caleb's arms hung limp at his sides. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on something only he could see, dark and unreflecting like polished obsidian. That was the moment, Silas told me, that the true horror began. Because the thing that walked into the house wasn't Caleb. It was just wearing him. Silas paused to repack his pipe. The lightning had moved closer, flashing bright enough to illuminate the deep lines etched into his face. He struck a match, the sulfur flare briefly overpowering the smell of the storm. "The dead don't come back, right, Arthur?" Silas murmured, smoke curling from his lips. "You can stitch the skin, but you can't put the light back in the eyes." Up on the ridge in 1934, the Vance household had become a tomb with a heartbeat. For the first few days, Martha tried to pretend. Mothers are built that way. Their capacity for denial is forged in iron. She bathed the boy, scrubbing the grave dirt from his skin, though the water in the basin turned black and oily, smelling of stagnant swamps. She dressed him in fresh clothes. She set a plate of grits and salt pork in front of him. But Caleb didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He didn't speak. He sat at the rough-hewn table, his hands folded on his lap, perfectly still. He didn't blink often enough. When he did, the eyelids moved slowly, like lizards basking on a cold rock. The other boys, Thomas and William, were terrified. They were young, but children have an instinct that adults bury under logic. They knew a predator when they saw one. They stopped playing in the kitchen. They huddled in the loft, whispering, refusing to make eye contact with the thing that wore their brother's face. "He's just recovering," Elias would snap, slamming his fist on the table when Martha noted the boy's lack of appetite. "He's been through a trial, woman. Give him time." Elias hovered over Caleb like a jealous dog guarding a bone. He brushed the boy's hair, talked to him for hours about hunting and the coming spring. Caleb just stared, his pupils blown wide, swallowing the light. Then the noises started. It began on the third night. Martha woke up to a sound, a rhythmic wet thud, thud, thud. She nudged Elias, but he was in a deep, exhausted sleep, a smile plastered on his face. Martha crept out of the bedroom, clutching her shawl. The sound was coming from the main room. She saw Caleb standing by the window. The moon was full, casting a pale, sickly glow across the floorboards. The boy was pressing his forehead against the cold glass. His hand was raised, and he was tapping a single, long fingernail against the pane. Tap, tap, tap. He wasn't looking out at the yard. He was looking at the tree line, specifically toward the ridge where the old oak tree stood. "Caleb?" Martha whispered. The boy's head snapped around. It didn't turn like a human head. It swiveled too smooth, too fast. His jaw hung slightly open, and in the moonlight, Martha saw that his teeth looked loose, like they were floating in black gums. He raised a finger to the glass again and scratched it. "Scritch." "Home," the boy rasped. It was the first word he had spoken. The voice sounded like dry leaves skittering over pavement. It wasn't a child's voice. It sounded ancient. Martha backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She ran back to the bedroom and shook Elias awake. "He spoke," she cried. "Elias, he spoke, but it wasn't him." "Hush!" Elias struck her across the face, the madness finally boiling over into violence. "Don't you speak ill of him. He's my son." The atmosphere in the house shifted from gloom to suffocating dread. The air grew colder, no matter how much wood Elias threw into the cast-iron stove. The milk in the pantry soured within hours. The family dog, a hardy coonhound named Blue, refused to enter the house. He spent his nights under the porch, whining and snapping at the air. One morning, they found Blue dead. He hadn't been attacked by a bear or a cougar. He was twisted up, his spine snapped, lying right at the foot of the back steps. There was no blood, just the dog, broken like a discarded toy. Caleb was sitting on the porch swing above the corpse, swaying gently back and forth. He was watching the flies gather on the dog's eyes. When Elias saw the dog, he didn't get angry. He just laughed, a dry, humorless bark. "Old dog was weak," he muttered, "making room for the strong." But the breaking point came a week later, on what would have been Caleb's 8th birthday. The rain had returned, lashing the valley. The house felt isolated, cut off from God and government. Martha was in the kitchen, chopping carrots with trembling hands. She could feel Caleb's eyes on her back. He was always watching now. Thomas, the middle child, came running down the ladder from the loft. He was pale, tears streaming down his face. "Mama," he sobbed, "make him stop." "Make who stop, Tommy?" "Caleb," the boy whispered, pointing up to the loft. "He whispers things while we sleep. He tells us how cold the dirt is. He says we have to come with him. He says the roots are hungry, Mama." Martha dropped the knife. It stuck into the floorboard, quivering. She looked at her husband. Elias was sitting in his rocking chair, whittling a piece of wood, humming a hymn that sounded all wrong in a minor key. "Elias," Martha said, her voice steady for the first time in days, "that is not our son. I don't know what you dug up, or what deal you made with that witch on the ridge, but that thing has no soul." Elias stopped whittling. He stood up slowly, the knife still in his hand. "He has my soul," Elias said softly, and the look in his eyes was no longer human. It was the look of a man who had stared into the abyss and found that he liked the view. "And tonight, we're going to celebrate his birthday. We're going to give him a gift." Elias looked at the two living boys, Thomas and William, huddled near the stove. "A trade," Elias whispered. "The earth gave one back. It expects two in return." The kitchen exploded into chaos. Elias lunged, the knife flashing in the dim light of the kerosene lamp. He wasn't aiming for Martha. He was aiming for Thomas. The boy screamed, scrambling backward, knocking over a chair. "It's a mercy!" Elias roared, his eyes wide and weeping. "Don't you see? They'll never be hungry again. The roots will hold them tight." Martha didn't scream. She didn't beg. The time for being a wife was over. She was a mother now, primal and vicious. She grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, the bacon grease still hot inside it, and swung it with every ounce of strength she possessed. Crack. Iron met bone. Ideally, Elias would have gone down, but the madness, or whatever black magic had seeped into him from the ridge, kept him standing. He staggered, blood pouring from his temple, and slashed blindly with the knife. The blade caught Martha's arm, but she didn't flinch. She shoved him hard. Elias stumbled back, his boots slipping on the slick floorboards. His flailing hand hit the kerosene lamp on the table. Glass shattered. The fuel sprayed across the dry timber walls and the curtains. In the blink of an eye, the room wasn't just lit. It was alive. The fire roared like a waking dragon climbing the wallpaper, eating the oxygen. "Run!" Martha screamed, grabbing Thomas and William by their collars. "Out! Now!" She dragged them toward the back door, coughing as the black smoke began to fill the room. The heat was instantaneous, blistering the skin on their faces. But Elias didn't chase them, as Martha kicked the back door open and shoved her weeping sons out into the mud and the rain. She looked back one last time. Elias was on his knees in the center of the inferno. The flames were licking at his clothes, his hair caught in the updraft. He wasn't trying to escape. He was crawling toward the corner where Caleb stood. The boy, the thing that looked like a boy, hadn't moved. The fire swirled around him, but he didn't burn. He stood perfectly still amidst the orange chaos, his hands clasped, watching his father crawl toward him. "I'm here, Caleb," Elias shrieked, his voice cracking as the smoke took his throat. "Daddy's here." And then, over the roar of the fire and the drumming of the rain, Martha heard it. Laughter. It wasn't the giggling of an 8-year-old child. It was a deep, guttural sound, like rocks grinding together deep underground. It was the laughter of the mountain itself, mocking the flesh that thought it could cheat the soil. Caleb looked at Martha through the flames. His mouth opened impossibly wide, unhinging like a snake, and the laughter poured out, louder than the collapsing roof beams. Martha slammed the door and ran. She dragged her boys through the mud, into the storm, not stopping until they reached the tree line. Behind them, the farmhouse collapsed inward with a sound like a bomb going off. The scream that cut through the night wasn't from the fire. It was Elias. It was a scream of absolute agonizing regret, cut short as the roof came down, burying him with the son he loved too much to let go. The present day, the boarding house porch. Silas stopped talking. His pipe had gone out long ago. The rain was still hammering against the tin roof of the Miller house, a steady, rhythmic drumming. I sat there, my drink forgotten, a chill settling into my bones that had nothing to do with the weather. "They never found the bodies?" Silas said quietly. "Fire burned too hot, melted the glass, turned the bones to ash. The locals say the ground just swallowed them up." "And the mother?" I asked. "Martha? The boys?" "Moved away," Silas said. He rubbed his left shoulder absently, as if an old scar was aching in the damp weather. "Tried to forget. But you don't forget something like that." He pointed his pipe stem at the floorboards beneath our feet. A few years later, a developer from Charleston bought the land, thought the location was prime for a boarding house for the railway men. They dug a new foundation, poured concrete right over the scorch marks. I froze. I looked down at the dark wood of the porch. "This house?" I whispered. "We're sitting on it?" Silas nodded slowly. "We are. The cellar is exactly where the root cellar used to be. My room is right where the kitchen stood." I stood up, suddenly desperate to be in my car, broken radiator or not. "Why would you stay here, Silas? If you know the story, why stay?" Silas looked up at me. His eyes were watery, reflecting the distant lightning. "Because someone has to make sure the window stays locked, Arthur," he whispered. "What window?" Silas leaned forward, and a flash of lightning illuminated a jagged, burn-like scar running down the side of his neck. A scar I hadn't noticed in the dim light. "The soil is patient," Silas rasped. "Elias paid the price, but the trade wasn't finished. Sometimes, on nights like this, when the rain softens the earth, tap, tap, tap." The sound came from the window directly behind me, the window of the parlor. My blood turned to ice. It was a distinct, sharp sound, like a long fingernail tapping against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I spun around. The parlor was dark, empty, but on the outside of the glass, illuminated by the porch light, was a small, muddy handprint. It was fresh. The fingers were impossibly long. "He wants to come in," Silas said, his voice trembling. "He gets lonely in the dirt." I didn't stay to see what was attached to the hand. I grabbed my keys, ran to my truck, and drove on the rim of a flat tire for 5 miles until I hit the county line. I never went back to Blackwood County. The conglomerate dropped the deal. But sometimes, when it rains hard and the wind hits my window just right, I can still hear it. Tap, tap, tap. The soil keeps what it takes, and it never stops hungering for more. The winter of '74 didn't just bring snow to northern Minnesota. It brought a silence so heavy you could feel it pressing against your eardrums. I was 12 years old, stuck in the back seat of a wood-paneled Chevy station wagon, watching the world turn into a blur of white and gray as my father navigated the icy roads toward my grandparents' farm. We were supposed to be there for Christmas, a festive retreat to the old homestead off County Road 9. But the mood in the car was anything but festive. My mother, Ellen, hadn't spoken a word since we passed the Duluth city limits. She was staring out the window, her reflection in the glass looking pale and hollowed out. 3 days ago, she had buried her high school best friend, a woman named Clara Vance. I didn't know much about Clara, other than she had died badly. A car wreck on black ice, the kind that leaves a closed casket. What I did know was that my mother had come home from the funeral shaking. Not from the cold, but from anger. Empty, she had whispered to my father in the kitchen, thinking I couldn't hear. The church was empty, Jim. Just me. The whole damn class of 58, and I was the only one who showed up. That sentence hung over us like the storm clouds gathering above the pines. We arrived at Grandma's farmhouse just as the sun was bleeding out behind the tree line. It was a massive, drafty Victorian thing that groaned in the wind. By 10 p.m., the blizzard had set in properly. The wind howled around the eaves, rattling the storm windows in their frames. Grandpa and Dad were already deep asleep in their armchairs by the fire, heavy with exhaustion from the long drive. Grandma was asleep in the back room. I was in the kitchen with Mom. She was nursing a cup of lukewarm tea, staring into the dark yard through the sliding glass door. The floodlight was off, leaving the world outside a pitch-black void. Then we heard it. Thump. It wasn't the wind. It was distinct, heavy, a dull, wet impact against the glass, like a bird flying into a window, but heavier. Mom froze. Her cup clattered into the saucer. Thump. Thump. Sarah, she whispered, her voice tight. Go get your father. Mom, it's probably just a branch, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. She shook her head and stood up, moving slowly toward the glass door. She cupped her hands against her eyes to shield the reflection of the kitchen light and peered out into the swirling snow. I watched her back stiffen. Her breath hitched in her throat. My God, she breathed. What? What is it? I scrambled off my chair and ran to her side. Through the glass, illuminated only by the faint, ghostly glow of the moon breaking through the clouds, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the backyard. It was about 30 feet away, standing knee-deep in a snowdrift. The figure was wearing a thin coat, far too light for 10 below zero weather. But the terrifying part wasn't the coat. It was the posture. The person was standing with their back to us, rigid, motionless. They weren't shivering. They were just standing there, staring into the dense forest that bordered the property. Is that Aunt Linda? Mom asked, her voice trembling. She said she might drive up from St. Paul. Why isn't she coming to the door? I asked. A cold prickle of unease ran down my spine. Why is she just standing there? She must have slid off the driveway, Mom said, panic seizing her. She grabbed her heavy wool coat from the hook. She's in shock. Sarah, grab a flashlight. Don't wake your dad. He's impossible to rouse once he's asleep. We need to get her inside before she freezes to death. I didn't want to go out there. Every instinct in my 12-year-old body screamed at me to lock the door and hide under the table. But Mom was already pulling her boots on, her face pale with worry. I grabbed the heavy metal flashlight from the counter and followed her. Mom slid the glass door open. The cold hit us like a physical blow, sucking the heat from our lungs instantly. The wind roared, stinging my eyes with ice pellets. Linda! Mom screamed into the dark. Linda, come inside! The figure in the snow didn't move. It didn't turn around. It just stood there facing the woods, black against the white snow. Mom grabbed my hand, her grip bruising. "Come on, quickly." We stepped off the porch and trudged into the deep snow. The crunch of our boots sounded deafeningly loud. My heart was hammering against my ribs. We were 20 feet away. 10 feet. "Linda?" Mom reached out, her hand trembling as she went to touch the shoulder of the figure in the thin coat. But just as her fingers brushed the fabric, a gust of wind swirled the snow around us, blinding me for a second. When the air cleared, there was no one there. The beam of the flashlight cut through the swirling white chaos, illuminating nothing. Just seconds ago, a woman had been standing there. I had seen the weave of her coat. Mom had been inches from touching her. Now there was only the driving snow and the dark, skeletal shapes of the pine trees swaying in the gale. "Linda?" Mom's voice cracked, snatched away by the wind. She spun around, sweeping the light in a frantic arc. "Linda, this isn't funny! Where are you?" My stomach dropped, a sensation like missing a step on a staircase in the dark. I looked down at the ground where the figure had stood. The snow lay thick and undisturbed, a pristine blanket of white powder. "Mom?" I choked out, grabbing her sleeve. "Mom, look!" She followed my gaze. "There are no footprints," I whispered, though I had to scream to be heard over the storm. We had trudged a deep, messy trench from the porch to this spot. But beyond our own boots, the snow was perfect. No tracks leading up from the driveway. No tracks leading into the woods. The figure hadn't walked here. It had simply been here. The color drained from Mom's face, leaving her looking as gray as the winter sky. The realization hit her hard, shattering her concern for her sister and replacing it with a primal, animalistic terror. "Go!" Mom gasped, shoving me back toward the house. "Sarah, get inside, now!" We turned and ran. Running in knee-deep snow is like running in a nightmare. Your legs feel heavy, leaden, while the panic screams at you to move faster. The wind was at our backs now, pushing us, as if the darkness itself was trying to usher us out of its domain. We reached the wooden steps of the porch, breathless and shivering. My hand scrambled for the handle of the sliding glass door. Creak. The sound stopped us both dead. It came from behind us. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, metallic screech of the old rusted iron gate that separated the backyard from the gravel driveway. A sound I had heard 1,000 times during summer visits. But the gate was heavy. It had a latch that required a strong hand to lift. And it was 30 yards away, obscured by the blizzard. Mom and I froze on the threshold. Against every survival instinct I possessed, I turned my head. Mom did too. The flashlight beam was shaking violently in my hand, dancing across the falling snow. There was no one at the gate, but the sound continued, the hinges groaning as if someone were slowly, deliberately pushing it open. Then the footsteps started. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They were heavy, deliberate steps, crushing the frozen crust of the snow. They were coming from the direction of the gate, moving toward the porch. But there was nothing there. The flashlight beam revealed only empty air and falling flakes. The sound of the invisible walker got closer. 20 feet, 10 feet. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt frozen solid. Then the footsteps stopped right at the bottom of the porch stairs. The silence that followed was louder than the storm. The air around us grew impossibly cold, not the natural cold of a Minnesota winter, but a vacuum, a void that sucked the heat right out of your blood. The hair on my arms stood up, piercing through the layers of my sweater. I felt a pressure against my ear. It wasn't a wind. It felt like lips, ice cold and blue, leaning in close. A voice, parched, raspy, and sounding like dirt rattling in a wooden box, spoke. It didn't speak to me. It spoke to my mother. "You were the only one who came, Ellen." It wasn't a shout. It was a clear, intimate whisper that cut through the roaring wind as if we were standing in a silent room. Mom screamed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. She threw herself at the sliding door, jamming it open, and shoved me inside so hard I fell onto the linoleum kitchen floor. She scrambled in after me, slamming the door shut and fumbling with the lock, her fingernails scratching against the glass. We collapsed on the kitchen floor, gasping for air, the warmth of the house feeling alien after the unnatural chill outside. "Did you hear it?" Mom was sobbing, clutching her chest, her eyes wide and staring at the locked glass door. "Sarah, tell me you didn't hear it." I couldn't speak. I just nodded. Outside, the floodlight finally flickered on, triggered by a power surge, or maybe just delayed timing. The backyard was empty. The snow near the porch was smooth and unbroken. There were no footprints coming from the gate. There were no footprints at the bottom of the stairs. But on the glass of the sliding door, right where Mom's face had been pressed moments ago, a patch of condensation was slowly fading. It looked like the fog left behind by a breath. And inside that fog, for just a second before it evaporated, I saw the faint, jagged outline of a crack. Not in the glass, but in the reflection of the world behind it. "Clara," Mom whispered, her voice trembling so hard it shook her whole body. It was Clara. The kitchen was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the ragged sound of our own breathing. We sat on the floor, backs pressed against the cabinets, watching the condensation fade from the glass door. "It was the wind, Sarah," Mom whispered, though her eyes were darting around the room like a trapped animal. "Just the wind and stress. Grief plays tricks on the mind." She was trying to rationalize it, trying to rebuild the wall of reality that had just been smashed by a whisper from the grave. Then the phone rang. Rang. The sound was shrill and violent in the quiet house. We both jumped. The rotary phone on the wall by the pantry screamed at us again. Rang. Mom scrambled up, her hands shaking so badly she could barely lift the receiver. She was hoping, praying, that it was the police, or a neighbor, or anyone alive. "Hello?" she choked out. I watched her face. The terror slowly morphed into confusion, and then into a deep, sinking dread. "Linda?" Mom said. "Where are you?" I stood up, hugging my arms to keep warm. You're still in St. Paul?" Mom asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But we saw. Are you sure you didn't drive up? The blizzard?" She listened for a moment longer, then slowly hung up the phone. She didn't turn around immediately. She stood facing the wall, her knuckles white as she gripped the counter. "Mom?" I asked softly. "That was your Aunt Linda," she said, her voice hollow. "She didn't come. The roads were closed 3 hours ago. She's been sitting by her fireplace in St. Paul all night." The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop another 10 degrees. If Linda was in St. Paul, then the figure in the thin coat, the figure with no face and no footprints, was exactly who Mom feared it was. "It was Clara," Mom whispered, turning to me. "I told you, Sarah. At the funeral, it was just me. Even her own husband didn't show up." He said he couldn't bear it, but I knew he just wanted to forget her. Her children moved west years ago. No friends, no family. She looked at the dark glass of the sliding door. I stood at that graveside alone in the freezing rain, Mom said, tears spilling down her cheeks. I was the only one who cared enough to say goodbye. Then she came to say thank you, I said, trying to find a silver lining, trying to make the horror stop. That's good, right? She came to say thank you. Mom looked at the expression on her face still haunts me to this day. It wasn't relief. It was a dawning, terrible realization. Sarah, she said softly. Clara wasn't a kind woman. She was possessive. She hated being alone. She used to say that if you loved someone, you kept them forever. Mom walked slowly toward the kitchen table. She didn't come to say thank you, Mom whispered. She came to collect. Collect what? Mom didn't answer. Instead, she pointed a trembling finger at the center of the kitchen table. I froze. When we had run into the house, the table had been empty. I was sure of it. We had been baking cookies earlier, and Mom had wiped it clean. But now, sitting perfectly in the center of the table was a single object. It was a funeral program. The paper was damp and crinkled, stained with mud. On the front cover was a grainy black and white photo of Clara Vance, smiling that tight, thin-lipped smile I had seen in Mom's yearbooks. But it was the smell that hit me first. The kitchen didn't smell like cookies anymore. It smelled of wet earth, dying lilies, and funeral scent. I walked closer, my legs feeling like jelly. Next to the pamphlet, melting onto the clean tablecloth, was a small pile of grayish snow. The footsteps hadn't stopped at the porch, I realized with a jolt of nausea. When we opened the door to escape the cold, we had let the cold in. I looked at the program. Written across Clara's forehead, in a dark, smudged substance that looked like charcoal or a dark stain, were 3 words. 1 for 1. The lights in the house flickered and died. In the sudden pitch blackness from the corner of the room right behind where my mother was standing, the whisper returned. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside the room with us. We're going to be best friends, Ellen, forever. My mother screamed, and this time the darkness swallowed the sound. We survived that night. We spent the rest of it huddled in the car with the heater running and the doors locked, waiting for the sun to rise. Dad never woke up. He slept through the whole thing in his recliner. But Mom was never the same after that. She stopped going to funerals. She stopped answering the phone after dark. And every winter, when the snow started to fall and the wind howled around the eaves, she would close the curtains tight and turn up the radio, terrified that if she listened closely enough, she would hear the sound of the gate creaking open, coming to claim the only friend who showed up. The corporate park after 8 p.m. isn't just quiet, it's sterile. It's a vacuum of gray carpet and humming server racks that feels like it's holding its breath. I'm the director of talent acquisition for a logistics firm in downtown Seattle. We occupy the 14th floor, a glass box overlooking the Puget Sound. On a rainy Tuesday in November, the view was just a wall of black water and city lights bleeding through the fog. I should have been home. My husband, Mark, had already texted me twice asking about dinner. But I was waiting for one last candidate. Her name was Mara Kovich. Her resume had hit my inbox that morning, and it was impeccable. Ivy League education, 10 years of supply chain management, and a cover letter that bordered on poetic. The only red flag was the time. She'd called at 5:30 p.m., her voice breathless and distorted by static, begging for a late slot. She said she was coming from a long way away. I'm a sucker for a go-getter. I told her I'd wait. By 8:15 p.m., the cleaning crew had already come and gone. The office was a ghost town of empty cubicles and powered-down monitors. The only light came from the hallway sconces and the glow of my laptop. I was just about to pack up and call it a no-show when the elevator chimed. Ding. It echoed through the empty floor like a gunshot. I stood up, smoothing my skirt, and walked out to the reception area. The glass doors slid open, and there she was. Mara didn't look like her resume implied. She was wearing a charcoal suit that looked expensive but dated, like something from a catalog in the late 90s. She was soaked to the bone, not just wet from the rain. She looked like she'd walked out of the sound itself. Her hair was plastered to her skull, dripping water onto the pristine lobby floor. "Miss Kovich?" I asked, putting on my professional smile. She looked up. The movement was jerky, mechanical. When her eyes met mine, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Her eyes were pale blue, almost white, and they didn't seem to focus on me. They looked through me, fixed on some point 1,000 yards behind my head. "I apologize for the delay," she said. Her voice was smooth, devoid of the static I'd heard on the phone, but it lacked something essential. It lacked warmth. The traffic was difficult. "It's Seattle," I joked, trying to break the tension. "Come on back." As she walked past me, I didn't smell rain. I smelled ozone, like the air right after a lightning strike, mixed with something copper and stale. We sat in my office. I offered her a water, but she declined with a slow shake of her head. "Let's just begin," she said. I started with the standard questions. "Tell me about your last role. How do you handle pressure?" Her answers were perfect. Too perfect. She spoke in complete, grammatically complex paragraphs, without pausing to think or breathe. She stared at me unblinkingly, her hands resting on her knees. That's when I noticed the trembling. Her hands weren't just shaking, they were vibrating. It was a subtle, high-frequency tremor, like a hummingbird's wings. But her face remained a mask of calm porcelain. "Are you cold?" I asked, glancing at the thermostat. It was set to 72, but I could see my own breath misting in the air between us. "I am adjusting," she said. "I haven't done this in a long time." "Interviewed?" "Interacted," she corrected. A chill crawled up my spine. I looked at her resume on my computer screen to check a date, and the screen flickered. The text on the document distorted, the letters stretching and bleeding down the digital page like melting wax. "ZRT." My monitor went black for a second, then rebooted. "Sorry, technical gremlins," I muttered, my heart rate picking up. I just wanted her out. The instinct was primal, a lizard brain warning that there was a predator in the room. Or maybe not a predator. Maybe something wrong. "I think I have everything I need, Mara," I said, standing up. My legs felt heavy. "You're a very strong candidate." She didn't stand up immediately. She looked around my office, her gaze lingering on the photos of my husband and me on the credenza. "You have a nice life here, Diane," she whispered. She knew my name. I hadn't introduced myself. I assumed she saw it on the door or the desk plaque. "Thank you," I said, moving toward the door, holding it open. "I'll walk you out." Mara stood up. As she passed me, she paused. She turned her head. Too far, an angle that looked uncomfortable and looked me dead in the eye. "I'll wait for you," she said. "Excuse me?" "I'll wait until you're ready. Outside." It sounded like a threat, but her tone was as flat as a dial tone. Before I could ask what she meant, she walked into the dark hallway toward the elevators. I waited 5 seconds, my hand on the doorknob, trembling. I just needed to grab my purse and lock up. I turned my back to the door for maybe 10 seconds to shove my laptop into my bag. I spun around, keys in hand, ready to sprint to the elevator. The hallway was empty. "Mara?" I called out. Silence. The corridor stretches 50 feet to the elevator bank. There is no way she could have made it to the elevators and waited for the doors to open in 10 seconds. The elevator indicator still showed lobby. It hadn't moved. I walked to the reception desk. "Hello?" Nothing but the hum of the vending machine. I didn't take the elevator. I took the stairs, running down 14 flights in heels, terrified that I would hear those wet footsteps behind me. I burst into the lobby, startling the night security guard, Benny. "Whoa, Diane, you okay?" Benny asked, looking up from his crossword puzzle. "The woman," I gasped, leaning on his desk. "The one in the gray suit. Did she just leave?" Benny frowned. "What woman?" "The candidate. She came in around 8:15, soaked wet. You had to buzz her in." Benny shook his head slowly. "Diane, I've been here since 6. Nobody has come in or out but the cleaning crew. The doors are mag-locked after 7. "No," I snapped. "Check the cameras. She was just in my office for 20 minutes. Benny saw the panic in my eyes. He swiveled his chair and pulled up the playback for the 14th floor. He rewound the tape to 8:15 p.m. I watched the screen, and my blood turned to ice. On the grainy black and white footage, I saw myself walk out to the reception area. I was smiling, extending my hand to greet someone, but I was shaking hands with the air. There was no one there. I watched myself lead an invisible guest back to my office. I watched myself sit at my desk, talking, nodding, offering water to an empty chair. The chair didn't even depress. "Diane," Benny said softly, "are you feeling okay?" I backed away from the desk. "Check the logs. She called me, Marakovich." I pulled out my cell phone to find the number in my call history. Unknown caller. I dialed it anyway. "We're sorry. The number you have reached is not in service." I ran back to the elevator. I had to know. Benny yelled after me, but I didn't stop. I rode the car back up to the 14th floor. The air in my office was still freezing cold. I woke up my computer. I searched my email for Marakovich. No results found. The resume was gone. The cover letter was gone. It was as if she had been deleted from existence. I felt like I was losing my mind. A psychotic break. That had to be it. I was overworked, tired, hallucinating. Then I looked at my desk. Right where the empty chair had been, there was a small puddle of water on the visitor's side of the desk. And stuck to my monitor was a yellow sticky note. I hadn't written it. The handwriting was jagged, sharp, and looked like it had been written with a heavy hand. It read, "I'll be waiting, Diane." I grabbed my purse and ran. I left the lights on. I left the door unlocked. I didn't stop running until I was in my car with the doors locked, sobbing. That was 3 days ago. I haven't gone back to work. I'm typing this from my living room with all the lights on. My husband tells me I need to see a doctor, that it was just stress, but he doesn't hear what I hear. Every time it rains, and in Seattle, it always rains, I hear it. a slow, heavy knocking on my front door. And when I check the doorbell camera, there's no one there. Just a wet patch on the porch and the static of a bad connection. She said she'd wait. And I think she is.
This happened in the early 90s, way before anyone had cell phones with flashlights. My dad was working as a junior accountant in Lower Manhattan and often worked late. That night, he was taking the R train back home to Brooklyn. The route goes through the old Montague Street tunnel, right underneath the East River. Somewhere in the middle of the tunnel, the train slammed on the brakes and stopped dead. For New York, this is totally normal. Nobody even looked up from their newspapers. The conductor came over the intercom, mumbled something about signal trouble ahead, and said we'd be moving shortly. And then, all the lights in the train completely shut off. It was pitch black. Only the dim emergency lights glowed at the far ends of the car. Sitting in a tunnel under a river in total darkness puts a heavy silence in your ears. People started groaning. Someone flicked a lighter, but it barely illuminated anything. A little girl at the other end of the car started crying, and then, cutting through the murmurs, my dad heard a new sound: rushing water. It kept getting louder. It sounded like a fast-flowing creek was running directly under the train wheels. Some guy in a suit nervously cleared his throat and announced to the car, "The tracks are flooded. We're gonna be stuck here a while." That sentence was a trigger. People started panicking. You're trapped in a metal tube under a massive river in total darkness, and you hear water rising. Someone started yelling that the tunnel was going to fill to the ceiling, and we were all going to drown. The train had been stuck for 10 minutes. Then came another sound. Slap. Squeak. Slap. It sounded like someone pressing wet, bare palms against the glass outside the train and dragging them. At first, my dad thought it was just someone inside the car messing around with the window out of boredom. But then he realized two things. First, the sound was moving. The invisible slapper walked from one end of the car to the other, paused, and then came back. And second, the sound was definitely coming from the outside. That's when the vibe in the car got genuinely terrifying. Some woman yelled, "Hey, quit messing around!" But a guy standing next to my dad whispered, "That's on the outside." The whole car went dead silent. The slapping moved to the other side of the train. Something or someone easily walked around the entire car, as if the gaps and couplings between the train cars weren't an obstacle. Also, subway windows are pretty high off the track bed, and the tunnels are incredibly tight. A regular person couldn't just casually and quickly walk out there while reaching the middle of the windows. The guy with the Zippo lighter was standing near the doors. When the sound of the wet slapping got close to him, he sparked the lighter, held the flame right up to the glass, and squinted. The people standing near him jumped back so hard the train car actually rocked. There was a face staring into the glass. It was pale, with a sickly, corpse-like bluish tint. My dad was standing a few feet away and only caught the details in the flicker of the lighter. Small, pitch-black eyes sunken deep into dark circles. Its mouth was hanging wide open, and the skin around the jaw was slack and sagging, like a drowning victim who had been in the water for weeks. The face was only visible for a second. The guy with the lighter just screamed and dropped it. The car plunged back into absolute darkness. Suddenly, the slapping outside went frantic. The thing started banging on the glass on both sides of the train. Someone shrieked hysterically, "Close the top windows!" Older NYC subway cars had little windows at the top that pulled down. People panicked, crushing together into the center of the car, pushing and shoving. And right then, my dad clearly heard the sound of water splashing inside the car, like someone had just dumped a bucket of water onto the floor through an open window slot. It was total chaos. Screaming, pushing, people grabbing onto each other's coats in the dark. My dad says those 5 minutes were the longest of his entire life. And then, the power snapped back on. The screaming stopped. People were panting, looking around wildly, staring in horror at the black windows. The slapping had stopped. The sound of rushing water was gone. The train lurched and slowly started moving forward. When we pulled into the first station in Brooklyn and the doors opened, people stampeded out like the train was on fire. The station attendants were totally confused. My dad stepped onto the platform and looked back at the train. The outside of the car, the windows and the doors were completely soaked, covered in dirty streaks of water. But you want to know the craziest part? The next day, the MTA released a standard delay report. The train had stalled because of a blown power relay. There was no flooding in the tunnel under the river. The tracks were completely dry. It was the middle of winter. Me and 3 coworkers had an assignment at a branch in Spokane, Washington. To avoid the terrible morning traffic in Seattle, we hit the road in my Chevy Tahoe before dawn. It was a blizzard outside, but inside the SUV, it was warm and quiet. To my surprise, my usually chatty coworkers passed out the second we merged onto I-90. I kept the radio off so I wouldn't wake them. The road was empty and monotonous, and a couple of hours in, I felt myself starting to nod off at the wheel. I decided to pull into the first mountain gas station I saw to stretch my legs and grab a coffee. I parked at a small 24/7 gas station that had a mini diner inside. There was no line at the register. I quickly poured myself a large black coffee and was just about to head for the exit when I noticed this strange guy. He looked to be in his 40s. He was sitting in the corner at a plastic table, unshaven, wearing a wrinkled jacket, holding a paper cup of tea. His hands were shaking so badly that the tea was sloshing onto the table. He wasn't blinking at all, just staring blankly into space, and his face was pale as chalk. I felt bad for him. I thought maybe he was having some kind of medical episode, so I walked over. "Good morning. Excuse me. Do you need any help?" I asked. The guy flinched, like he had just woken up and struggled to focus his eyes on me. What?" "No, thank you," he mumbled. "I'm just not feeling very well." You could tell something had deeply shaken him. Right at that moment, the glass door of the gas station opened, and my sleepy coworker shuffled in to use the restroom. I realized I had a couple of minutes to spare, so I tried to get the poor guy talking. "Listen, tell me what happened. Just get it off your chest. You'll feel better." The guy let out a heavy sigh and looked up at me. "Honestly, I don't even know what to believe anymore," he started. 3 days ago, I was driving east on this exact same highway, dropping off a relative. It's getting late, pitch black outside, and just my luck. The high beams on my pickup truck go out. I can't see a damn thing in front of me. Suddenly, I see a guy standing on the shoulder of the road, hitchhiking. There are 0 cars out here at that hour. And the craziest part is, he's totally underdressed for the weather. It's freezing winter, but he's just wearing a hoodie. No hat, no heavy jacket. I slam on the brakes, roll down the window and ask, "Hey man, what's wrong? Why are you dressed so light? Let me give you a ride somewhere." And he answers, completely calm, "No, thank you. My friend should be coming to get me soon." I double-check. "Are you sure? You're going to freeze to death out here." "Don't worry about me," he says. "Just be careful yourself. There's a really dangerous curve up ahead. The warning sign got knocked down so you can't see it in the dark. Slow down." I thanked him. I told him his warning was right on time since I was driving without high beams. I wished him luck and drove off. Sure enough, about 600 yards later, a sharp bend in the road. If I hadn't slowed down to a crawl, I absolutely would have flown off into the ditch. As I'm turning, I see the metal guardrail is smashed in one spot. I remember thinking, someone got really unlucky there. The guy paused and took a sip of cold tea from his shaking cup. "So, I dropped my relative off, handled my business," he continued. "Today, I'm driving back. I stopped here to get a coffee. I'm standing at the register, and there's a TV up near the ceiling playing the local morning news. I don't usually watch the news, but I caught it out of the corner of my eye. His voice broke. The anchor says the police have finally identified a man who recently crashed on the highway near here, and they show his picture. When I saw it, I almost passed out. The photo was the exact same guy in the hoodie who warned me about the dangerous curve. He looked me dead in the eye. The news said he crashed and died almost a week ago. I'm standing there thinking, did a dead man just save my life? At that moment, my co-workers called my name. They were already waiting by the exit. I didn't know what to say to the guy. I just nodded, told him to take care of himself, and walked out into the cold. For the entire rest of the drive to Spokane, I couldn't stop thinking about that story. And you know what? Now, I always make sure to brake when I see a sharp turn ahead. When we're teenagers, a lot of us mess around with Ouija boards, urban legends, or mirror games. Usually, we just do it out of boredom to scare ourselves, and nothing actually happens. But a case from the winter of 1998 in Minnesota shows that sometimes it's better not to play those games at all. Local police still keep this file in the archives classified as a wild animal attack or a home invasion. But the first responders who worked the scene know the truth. Bears don't know how to knock on the front door, and bears definitely don't try to speak to you in the voices of your loved ones. It happened on Christmas Eve. Two girls, let's call them Chloe and Becky, went to spend the holidays at Chloe's family hunting cabin deep in the woods. Cell service was practically non-existent out there. Their boyfriends were long-haul truckers and were supposed to join them, but a massive blizzard shut down the highways. The guys got stranded at a truck stop in the next state over and called from a payphone to say they wouldn't make it for a couple of days. The girls were stuck in the cabin, listening to the howling wind, completely bored out of their minds. They had a bit of wine, and Chloe suggested a stupid idea. She had read somewhere that if you sit in front of a mirror with a lit candle exactly at midnight and call out for your soulmate, you'll see their face in the reflection. Becky laughed at it, but they had nothing better to do, so she agreed. They turned off the lights, lit a candle, and sat in the hallway in front of an old mirror. They sat there for about 10 minutes. Becky was just about to call it quits when Chloe suddenly jerked back, dropped the candle, and screamed, "I saw headlights! In the mirror! They're coming!" Becky figured her friend was just tipsy or messing with her. But a couple of minutes later, cutting right through the sound of the blizzard, they both clearly heard a noise outside. The crunch of heavy tires rolling over deep snow. The low rumble of a diesel engine. The slam of a truck door, and then male voices. There was a loud knock on the front door. Chloe squealed with excitement. They made it through the storm! She ran to the door, threw the deadbolt, and pulled it open. Two tall male figures in winter gear stepped into the hallway, dusted with snow. Chloe yelled happily and threw her arms around her boyfriend's neck. But Becky stayed frozen in place. Her flight-or-fight response kicked in hard. She looked at the second guy, who was supposed to be her boyfriend Dan, and realized something was fundamentally wrong with him. His face was unnaturally pale, almost gray. And his eyes. He wasn't blinking at all. He was just staring at her with this glassy, empty look. And they didn't smell like cologne or diesel fuel. They smelled like damp earth and something rotting. When the guy reached his arms out and took a step toward her, Becky didn't even think. Pure survival instinct took over. She spun around, bolted through the kitchen to the back door, ran out into the freezing cold, and sprinted for the old storm cellar in the backyard. She jumped inside, slammed the heavy wooden doors shut, and slid the massive steel bolt into place. Sitting in the freezing, pitch-black cellar, Becky listened as a nightmare unfolded inside the cabin. It didn't sound like a happy reunion. There was the crash of heavy furniture breaking, loud thuds, and then Chloe screamed. But the scream was cut short very quickly. After that, Someone started pacing heavily and rhythmically across the wooden floorboards. Becky sat in the dark, covering her mouth with both hands so she wouldn't make a sound. Closer to morning, heavy footsteps crunched through the snow right above her head. Someone walked up to the cellar doors. "Becky," a voice called out from the yard. It sounded like her boyfriend, but distorted, like a bad tape recording. "Come out. Why are you hiding? Let us in." The door handle rattled. Then someone slammed their weight against the doors a few times, but the steel bolt held. Eventually, the footsteps walked away. The engine roared to life, and the truck drove off. Becky stayed in that cellar until noon, when a county snowplow driver finally came down the road. He saw the cabin door wide open and called the police. Becky only came out when she heard the sirens. The inside of the house was completely trashed. The police didn't let Becky into the kitchen, whatever they found in there. Let's just say Chloe had a closed casket funeral. Officially, the police stated that a starving bear had broken into the cabin looking for food, but they found no animal tracks or tire prints in the snow. The blizzard had wiped everything clean. And the real boyfriends, Mark and Dan, they had been stuck at a motel in North Dakota the entire time, with dozens of witnesses to prove it. Becky survived, but the psychological trauma was severe. To this day, she jumps at the sound of a knock on the door, and whenever a blizzard hits in the winter, she locks herself in her bathroom, because over the howling wind, she thinks she can still hear the crunch of snow tires and that creepy, distorted voice calling her name. In my family, we don't really talk much about my great-aunt Karina. She lived in an old stilt house out in the rural backwoods of South Carolina. The locals were actually pretty scared of her. They thought she was some sort of local witch or root doctor. There were always rumors that she could cure your sickness, but also cause you some serious problems if you crossed her. I never believed in any of that paranormal stuff. I just thought it was old Southern folklore, at least not until the winter day we buried her. The day her completely empty house was somehow bolted from the inside. But to give you some context, I have to go back a bit. It all started with a bush in her backyard. Aunt Karina had this massive wisteria vine growing in her yard. Every spring, it bloomed so heavily that the sweet smell would literally give the neighbors a headache. Karina absolutely loved that plant. She babied it, constantly pouring weird homemade mixtures onto its roots. The problem was, the branches grew completely over the chain link fence into her neighbor's yard, a grumpy mechanic named Henderson. He hated the bush, always complaining that the leaves were clogging his gutters. So, one morning in May, he just took a gas-powered hedge trimmer and completely hacked off the entire side of the bush facing his property. It looked awful. Half the plant was just shredded and hanging off the fence. My mom was visiting Karina that day. She said Karina walked out onto the porch, looked at the mess, and didn't yell or throw a fit. She just said quietly, "He's going to regret touching what's mine. He'll choke on his own bitterness." And she never brought it up again. A month later, Henderson died in his garage. He suffered a massive asthma attack. His throat swelled up so fast, he just suffocated before he could get to his inhaler. Was it a coincidence? Probably. But my family didn't think so. Later that same year, Karina, probably realizing she was getting old, tried to pass down her knowledge to my older sister, Abby. She would make Abby sit with her and tried to teach her these weird chants and practices. Abby was terrified and just stopped visiting her. So, the gift was never passed on. And in December, Karina quietly passed away in her sleep. The day of the funeral was weird from the start. It was late December, but the weather was freakishly hot, around 80 degrees. The air was thick and humid, and the dirt at the cemetery was basically mud. After Karina was buried, the whole family drove back to her house for the wake. My mom got to the front porch first, put the key in the oak door, and turned it. The lock clicked, but the door wouldn't open. My mom jiggled the handle. Nothing. "Wood's probably just swollen from the humidity," my older brother Jackson said. He moved her out of the way and shoved his shoulder hard against the door. Useless. It didn't budge an inch. We started to panic. We thought maybe one of the older relatives had left the cemetery early, gone inside, and passed out or had a heart attack. We knocked, yelled, peeked through the windows. Total silence inside. Finally, Jackson went to his pickup truck, grabbed a crowbar, jammed it between the door and the frame, and busted the door open with a loud crack. When the door swung in, we all just froze on the porch. The heavy cast-iron deadbolt, a thick horizontal sliding latch, was pushed shut. From the inside, someone had bolted the door after we all left for the funeral. We tore the house apart looking for an intruder. We checked every room, under every bed, inside every closet. The house was completely empty. And there was no way a draft or wind could have slid that latch. You had to physically push it hard with your hand. Grandpa Elias, Corinne's widowed husband, stubbornly refused to move out of the house after that. My brother Jackson ended up moving in with him just so the old man wouldn't be alone. And that's when things got really creepy. Almost every single night, Jackson and Elias would hear footsteps. Normal, heavy footsteps. They would start in Corinne's old bedroom, walk down the hardwood hallway, stop right at the front door, as if checking the lock, and then walk back. My grandpa jumped out of bed a few times with his shotgun, thinking someone had broken in, but the hallway was always empty. This happened every night and was driving them crazy. But on exactly the 40th day after Corinne's death, the footsteps just stopped. Completely. The house has been quiet ever since, but every spring, that wisteria vine in the backyard blooms like crazy. And you know what? Not a single neighbor ever goes near it with a pair of clippers. It all started in October. My mom, Eleanor, lived in Oregon, about 300 miles away from us. She suffered a sudden, massive stroke. My husband David and I dropped everything and drove our old Ford through the pouring rain all night, but we only made it in time to say goodbye. At the funeral, while standing by the open casket, I noticed a detail. She was still wearing her favorite vintage Bulova watch on her left wrist. I asked my sister if she wanted to take it off as a keepsake. My sister shook her head, her eyes red and puffy. "There's no point, Sarah," she said. The exact second her heart stopped, the watch stopped too. I tried to wind it, but the mechanism is completely jammed. It was creepy, sure, but I wrote it off as a bizarre coincidence. The watch was 30 years old, after all. We returned home to Seattle completely emotionally drained. David's mother, Margaret, lived with us. She was a tough 70-year-old woman who baked pancakes every morning and spent her afternoons in the garden. When we walked in, she made us tea and said quietly, "You kids go get some sleep, rest up. Tomorrow, it'll be my turn to rest." I didn't think anything of it. I assumed she just meant she was tired of doing the chores while we were gone. But 2 days later, as we were finally trying to get back into our normal routine, I noticed Margaret hadn't come down for breakfast. I went up to her room. She was sitting in her favorite rocking chair, staring out the window at the drizzle. She was dead. Massive heart failure, even though she had a clean bill of health. I walked over to check her pulse, and my eyes dropped to her wrist. Her gold Timex had stopped. The second hand was frozen between the 3 and the 4. I had literally just changed the battery for her a month prior. Out of pure stubbornness and a rising sense of dread, I popped the back off and put a new battery in. Nothing. The watch was as dead as she was. We buried her with it. There's a dark superstition out in the Midwest and up here in the Pacific Northwest. If 2 elderly people in the same family die within 40 days of each other, They don't cross over alone. They take someone young with them to help carry their baggage to the other side. I tried not to think about it. But then the dreams started. Every single night, my mom, Eleanor, stood at the foot of my bed. She wasn't a scary movie monster or a decaying ghost. She was just standing there in her Sunday dress, looking at me, and waiting. In the dream, I would ask her, "Mom, who are you waiting for? Who are you taking?" She would just smile softly, press a finger to her lips, and fade into the darkness. 5 nights in a row, the exact same dream. I became terrified of going to sleep. I was drinking pots of coffee, jumping at every phone ring. I was terrified for my husband, terrified for our kids. But on the 6th night, the dream changed. Mom was standing by the bed again, but this time she didn't stay silent. She tapped the stopped Bulova watch on her wrist and said, "Where's Tyler going at this hour? I guess he's in a hurry to give us a ride. It's time to go, Sarah." It hit me like a jolt of electricity. I woke up screaming so loud I woke David up. Tyler, my 22-year-old nephew, the pride of the family, an engineering student at college. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand. It was 2:15 a.m. I dialed Tyler's apartment. His girlfriend answered, sounding groggy and annoyed. "Where is he?" I yelled. "Sarah, why are you calling right now? Tyler left a couple of hours ago in his Chevy Silverado. Someone gave him a bunch of scrap lumber out in the county, and he decided to haul it up to his parents' cabin tonight, so he wouldn't miss class in the morning." "Why, what's wrong?" "Nothing," I lied, feeling a chunk of ice form in my throat. Just a bad dream. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, staring at the wall clock. The phone rang at 7 a.m. It was the highway patrol. There had been a tragedy up on Snoqualmie Pass. A semi-truck had spilled a massive load of industrial gravel on a blind curve. It had been raining, and the road turned into a slip and slide. Tyler's truck hit that gravel like stepping on marbles, lost control, and smashed through the guardrail. He went down the embankment, and 3 other cars piled up right behind him. The wreck caught fire. Nobody made it out. Tyler had a closed casket funeral. And you know what the most horrifying part of all of this is? The state trooper who handed us his surviving personal effects in a plastic bag looked at us with this confused, pale expression and said, "His watch got a little charred. But the weird thing is, it didn't break from the impact or the fire. The gears inside are just completely fused together." The dream stopped after that. Mom never came back. Death had filled its quota, 2 elders and a young driver, and finally left our family alone. But now, whenever the house gets too quiet, I can't stand the sound of a ticking watch. I immediately take the batteries out, because I know that as long as they're ticking, we're alive. But when they stop, they're coming for us. I was 8 years old. It was a suffocatingly hot summer in Nebraska. We were staying with my grandparents on an old farm surrounded by miles of cornfields. Grandma Betty spent her days in the kitchen, canning peaches. My grandfather, Arthur, lay in the adjoining dining room. A year prior, he had suffered a massive stroke that left him paralyzed from the waist down. He was confined to a medical bed and barely spoke. That day, I realized something else was living in our house, something watching us from the dark corners. It was around 2 in the afternoon. The sun was beating mercilessly through the living room windows, dust motes swirling lazily in the air. The smell of boiling sugar, the clinking of glass jars, and the soft murmur of the radio drifted in from the kitchen. It was idyllic. I was sitting on the shag carpet with my back to a heavy velour sofa, putting together a puzzle. Suddenly, I heard a voice. It came from right behind me, from under the sofa. It wasn't a growl or a creepy rasp. On the contrary, the voice was incredibly high, sweet and gentle, like a kindergarten teacher wanting to offer you a piece of candy. "Lucy," the voice sang out. "Turn around, Lucy. Look at me." I wasn't scared. After all, it was daytime. Country music was playing, and my grandma was rattling pots just 20 feet away. I thought my sister was hiding behind the couch to play a prank on me. I smiled and turned my head. What looked back at me from under the sofa skirt burned a scar into my memory that will never heal. It was a face, but not a human one. Pale, hairless skin stretched tight over an elongated skull. The creature had a snout, like a boar's, but mutated, with flared nostrils. And its eyes. They weren't black or empty. They were bright red, bloodshot, and burned with such concentrated, pure malice that my breath caught in my throat. It smiled at me with thin gray lips. I screamed. It was a primal, lung-tearing shriek. I scrambled up, knocking over the puzzle, and bolted into the kitchen, crashing into my grandmother. I sobbed, pointing a shaking finger at the living room. Grandma grabbed a fire poker and searched the room, but there was nothing under the sofa but dust. She didn't scold me for having an overactive imagination. She went pale, pulled out an old Bible, and began reading prayers, sprinkling the corners of the living room with holy water. But it was too late. The creature knew I had seen it, and it was waiting for nightfall. That same night, I woke up unable to move. Sleep paralysis. The room was bathed in pale moonlight. My sister and grandmother were sleeping in the adjacent bed, their breathing slow and steady. And then I felt it. A weight on my legs. Something pulled the blanket off me. I darted my eyes downward. That creature with the red eyes and pig snout was sitting at the foot of my bed. In the dark, it looked even larger. It stared at me, and then it wrapped its bony fingers, tipped with needle-like claws, around my ankles. The pain wasn't physical, it was unnatural. A burning, paralyzing cold. I screamed at the top of my lungs, "Grandma, help!" But the sound came out muffled, as if I were screaming underwater. The creature forcefully pulled my feet toward the darkness, and I felt an icy terror lock my legs in place. My grandmother and sister didn't even twitch. They were dead to the world, as if under some dark hypnosis. I closed my eyes, preparing for it to drag me away forever. And suddenly, a hand gripped my ankle with immense force. The hand was heavy, human, and freezing cold. I threw my eyes open. The creature let out a pig-like squeal, bounded off the bed, and melted into the shadows as if it had been scalded. Next to my bed, on the floor, lay my paralyzed grandfather, Arthur. He was breathing heavily, his calloused hand gripping my ankle tightly. To save me, this half-paralyzed old man had somehow dragged himself out of his medical bed in the kitchen and pulled his dead weight across the floor, using only his arms, through the pitch-black house, all because he heard my scream when no one else did. The next morning, my grandfather was furious. He wheezed and yelled at my grandmother for sleeping, while that thing tried to take a child. When Grandma took off my socks, she gasped. Around my ankles were dark, almost black bruises, perfectly matching the grip of long claws. We didn't pack our bags. We just got into Grandma's Plymouth in the clothes we were wearing and drove to my mom's place in the city. We never went back to that farm. They say evil lives in the dark, but I know the truth. Evil can call your name in a sweet voice in the middle of a sunny day. And sometimes, the only guardian angel that can save you is a paralyzed old man whose love was stronger than any demonic magic.
I listened to that clock tick every single night for 3 years. It was driving me insane. I couldn't sleep. I hated that sound. And then, one night, I finally snapped. I got up, ready to smash it into a million pieces. I flipped on the light, looked at the wall, and my blood turned to ice. My Aunt Meredith lived in a massive, drafty Victorian house up in Maine. It was one of those places that always smells like old paper and sea salt. When I was in college, I used to drive up there on weekends to help her out with groceries and yard work. I always slept in the guest room on the second floor. It used to be my Uncle Arthur's study before he passed away. Uncle Arthur was eccentric. The room was filled with what he called artifacts and what I called nightmare fuel. Ritual masks from the Congo, cracked mirrors that distorted your reflection, taxidermy birds that looked like they were judging you for your sins. But the worst thing in that room wasn't the dead birds. It was the clock. It was an old, heavy German wall clock, dark mahogany, brass pendulum, and it was loud. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It didn't just make noise, it vibrated the air. It was a slow, mechanical heartbeat that seemed to get louder the moment I turned off the lights. For years, I laid in that bed, staring at the ceiling, grinding my teeth to the rhythm of that clock. But I never complained. Aunt Meredith loved that room, and I didn't want to be the rude nephew asking to move the furniture. 3 years ago, Uncle Arthur died. A heart attack. Aunt Meredith took it hard. I started visiting every weekend to make sure she was eating and taking care of herself. I was still sleeping in the study, and the ticking was still driving me insane. If anything, it seemed louder now that the house was so quiet. It was oppressive. Tick. Tock. It felt like it was counting down to something inevitable. The breaking point came in August of 2011. It was a humid, sticky night. The air conditioning was broken, and I was lying in a pool of my own sweat, tossing and turning. 2 a.m. Tick. Tock. 3 a.m. Tick. Tock. I couldn't take it anymore. The sound was drilling into my skull. I felt like if I heard one more mechanical click, I was simply going to scream. I threw the covers off. I was furious. Sleep deprivation does terrible things to a person. That's it, I muttered. I'm either taking the batteries out, or I'm throwing the damn thing out the window. I scrambled out of bed in the pitch black, fumbled for the light switch, and flipped it on. I spun around to face the wall, ready to rip the clock off its hook. And I froze. My anger evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold feeling that started in my stomach and shot all the way to my fingertips. I stood there, blinking in the harsh light, staring at the wall. There was no clock. There was just a rectangular outline on the faded floral wallpaper, a pale patch where the sun hadn't hit for decades. A single rusty nail stuck out of the plaster. But there was no clock. I stood there for 5 minutes, shaking. I thought I was having a stroke. I could still hear the echo of the ticking in my head, fading away like a dying memory. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, pale as a sheet. Aunt Meredith poured me a coffee. "You look terrible, Mark," she said. "Did you sleep at all?" "Aunt Meredith," I whispered, my hands trembling around the mug. "The clock in the study, the big wall clock. Where is it?" She looked at me, confused. "The German clock? Oh, honey, we threw that out 3 years ago." I stared at her. "What?" "It fell off the wall the day of Arthur's funeral," she said quietly. "It shattered into a million pieces. I cleaned it up myself. The room has been empty of his things since then." I didn't finish my coffee. I packed my bag and left an hour later. Now you can call me crazy. You can say I was hallucinating from grief or exhaustion. You can say I just imagined the sound because I was used to it from my childhood. But explain this to me. If the clock was broken, And if the clock was gone, what exactly was I listening to for 3 years? People often ask me if I'm afraid of living alone in a 100-year-old house. They ask if I hear footsteps, or if I ever feel like I'm being watched. And I always tell them the truth. I'm not afraid of the thing that lives in my house. In fact, I think it saved my life. But there's a catch. It hates guests. And if you overstay your welcome, it won't just hide your keys. It will stand in the dark corner of your room, and it will breathe until you get the hell out. It all started about 3 months after my husband and I moved into my great-aunt's old place in the middle of nowhere, Ohio. It's one of those drafty Victorian builds with high ceilings and a basement that smells like wet pennies. It was late November, freezing cold. My husband was away on a business trip, so I was home alone. I decided to make a pot of beef stew. I had the heavy cast-iron Dutch oven simmering on the gas range for hours. The whole house smelled like rosemary and thyme. Around 11 p.m., I was dead on my feet. I turned off the TV, locked the back door, and dragged myself upstairs. My brain thought I had turned off the stove. You know how it is. Autopilot. I was 100% sure I had turned that dial to off. I climbed into bed. We have this old wrought iron bed frame with a mattress that's a little too bouncy. I buried myself under the down comforter and was out like a light within seconds. I was in a deep, heavy sleep, the kind where you're practically dead to the world. And then, wham! I woke up screaming. Something heavy, and I mean heavy, like a bowling ball or a large dog, had jumped onto the foot of the bed. The mattress depressed violently. I felt the shock wave of it travel up my legs. I sat up, clutching the sheets to my chest, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The room was pitch black. The bedroom door was closed. With a trembling hand, I reached for the lamp. Click. The room was empty, but there at the foot of the bed, right in the center of the duvet, was a perfect circular indentation. It looked like someone or something was sitting there, invisible, watching me. I watched as the indentation slowly rose back up, as if the weight had just lifted. I didn't stick around to ask questions. I grabbed the baseball bat I keep under the bed and sprinted downstairs, fully expecting to find a burglar. I ran into the kitchen and froze. The gas stove was still on. The flame was high, licking the bottom of the pot. The liquid had boiled down to almost nothing. The meat at the bottom was already blackening. Another 20 minutes, and the grease would have caught fire. The whole house, dry old wood and wallpaper, would have gone up like a matchbox. I turned off the gas, my hands shaking so bad I could barely grip the handle. I stood there in the silence of the kitchen, listening to the ticking clock. I wasn't scared anymore. I felt looked after. "Thank you," I whispered to the empty room. The floorboards upstairs creaked in response, a slow, heavy settling sound, like a nod. After that, I made peace with it. I called him the landlord. We had an agreement. I took care of the house and he looked out for me. But the landlord was picky about visitors. A few months later, my best friend from college, Jessica, came to stay. She's loud, energetic, a bit chaotic, the kind of person who leaves her shoes in the middle of the hallway. She was supposed to stay for a week. She lasted 2 nights. The first morning, she came down to breakfast looking pale, with dark circles under her eyes. "Em," she said, stirring her coffee nervously. "Does your husband walk around at night?" "No," I answered. "He sleeps like a log." "Why?" Jessica rubbed her shoulders. Someone was walking in the hallway last night, back and forth. Scuff, 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 like they were wearing old wool slippers. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I laughed it off. Old house, Jess. Noisy pipes. The next night was worse. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of Jessica packing her suitcase in the guest room. I went in, and she was crying. Actually shaking. "I can't stay here, Em," she whispered. "I'm sorry." "What happened?" She pointed to the corner of the room, behind an old oak chest I used for storage. "There's someone behind the chest," she hissed. "I heard him. He was standing right there in the dark. He was sighing. Just this long, heavy, angry sigh, like he was annoyed that I was breathing his air." She left that same night, drove all the way to a motel on the highway. After that, Jessica and I drifted apart. She stopped calling, stopped visiting. It seemed like the house decided she didn't belong in my life, and it pushed her out. My husband and I still live there. I haven't felt the weight on the bed since that night. But sometimes, when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I hear that soft, shuffling sound in the hallway. Never, you hear me? Never sleep in a cemetery. I wouldn't advise it, not after what happened to me. This was back in the early 90s. I was bouncing between careers and snagged a temporary gig. I had to measure old tombstones in one of those famous above-ground cemeteries. I think it was Lafayette number 1. You know the vibe? Crumbling stone crypts, Spanish moss everywhere. The meeting with the foreman was set at the main gates for 6 a.m. sharp. I arrived on time, but I was feeling, let's say, fragile. My buddies and I had partied a little too hard on Bourbon Street the night before. I wasn't drunk anymore, but I was definitely in a fog. I looked around and saw an old stone bench under a magnolia tree right by the gates. It looked like paradise. I thought, why not? Just rest my eyes for 5 minutes. I balled up my canvas work bag, used it as a pillow, and lay down on the cool stone. It was quiet, peaceful. I passed out. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke up because someone was speaking. It was a voice, smooth, melodic, and incredibly refined. "Monsieur, il est très imprudent." "Sir, that is very imprudent." I cracked one eye open. Standing right over me, blocking out the sun, was a man. But calling him just a man is an understatement. He was tall, skinny as a skeleton. He was covered in dirt. He was wearing rags that looked like an antique tailcoat. He looked like he had just crawled out of a crumbled crypt after 100 years. But here's what got me. He was speaking French. My French is terrible. I know bonjour and merci, and that's it. But as I lay there, paralyzed by the sight of this guy, I understood every word he said. Like his voice bypassed my ears and whispered directly into my brain. He looked at me with piercing, intelligent eyes, too bright for a man who looked like a walking corpse, and wagged a long, dirty finger right in my face. "Monsieur, you really shouldn't sleep in a cemetery. It is risky," he said. I couldn't move. I was frozen. He continued. He said sleeping here was dangerous for my health, dangerous for my wallet, and dangerous for my soul. "Wake up," he whispered, leaning closer. I smelled dry dust and old flowers. I gasped and sat up abruptly on the bench, my heart hammering against my ribs. Who are you?" I stammered, looking around. But the path was empty. I stood up and spun around. The cemetery was silent. No footsteps, no rustling bushes. In the blink of an eye, the tall man in rags had vanished. A minute later, an old Chevy truck pulled up to the gates. The foreman jumped out with a coffee. "Morning, son," he yelled. "Sorry I'm late. Been waiting long?" I stared at him, my hands still shaking. I wanted to ask if he'd seen a skeleton walking down the road. I wanted to ask if this place was haunted, but I didn't. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "Just got here myself. I did the job. I measured the tombs. But all that time, and to this day, I don't know what that was. Was it the ghost of some old Creole aristocrat? Or just a homeless guy with a flair for theatrics and perfect French? I don't know. But I took his advice. I never slept in a cemetery again.